Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this Edith festival. I'm delighted that there is a celebration of a figure who is often forgotten and certainly not known about by many people, but was a crucial figure in late Anglo-Saxon England. Well, this afternoon I'm going to be speaking about Edith Swanneshals and her relationship with the Abbey of Bury St Edmunds. Now, this is something that we don't know a great deal about. The direct evidence for it is somewhat meagre. But I am going to be speaking about the network of aristocratic benefactors like Edith, who supported the shrine and monastery of St Edmund in the 11th century. Now, the extent to which Edith herself was among them is a matter of debate. I'm going to make some suggestions as to how she might have been part of that network. But her extensive East Anglian landholdings meant that she was certainly part of the same networks that supported what was at this time fast becoming East Anglia's most important monastery. But before turning to the question of Edith's possible involvement in the cult of St Edmund and the abbey associated with it, we ought to consider the background to the development of the monastery at Bury St Edmunds and its significance to England as a whole. Edmund, king of the East Angles, was slain by Viking invaders on the 20th of November, 869. But it was what would happen after Edmund's death that would turn out to be rather more significant than anything Edmund did in life. Edmund's body and decapitated head were recovered by his followers and buried at the site of his martyrdom, where they became the focus of a cult that helped to preserve East Anglia's Christian identity during the period of Danish occupation. The Danes, of course, at the time that they invaded East Anglia in 865, were heathens. Within a few decades, however, they'd become Christian, and it was the cult of St Edmund that had a great deal to do with that. By around 890, the Danish kings of East Anglia were not only Christians, but they'd begun minting coins commemorating St Edmund and mimicking the dead king's own issues. It may have been around this time that the body of St Edmund was exhumed, taken from the chapel in the woods where the king was killed, and taken to the nearby town of Biodrixworth, where the body was enshrined in the wooden church of St Mary. So great was the fame of St Edmund that Biodrixworth was soon renamed as Bury St Edmunds, the Burr of St Edmund, in effect. Edmund's shrine soon became renowned for its miracles. The saint's body remained incorrupt, which was seen as a special favour bestowed only on a handful of saints, such as Ethelthryth of Ely and Cuthbert. However, Edmund also had a habit of avenging himself, such as when a group of thieves tried to steal jewels and gold from the shrine and found themselves frozen in the act until they were caught red-handed in the morning. Edmund's wider significance to England was down to his role as the martyr par excellence of the Viking invasion of 865 onwards, that same invasion that set in train the series of events that would result in the unification of England as a single kingdom under the House of Wessex. Now, Edmund didn't belong to the royal house of Wessex. He belonged to an unrelated royal house, the Woffings of East Anglia. But as a result of the Danish invasions, as a result of the division of England between the House of Wessex and the Danelaw, the House of Wessex began to identify with Edmund himself. It was at the court of Athelstan in around 924 that the story of St Edmund was told to a young St Dunstan by an old man who claimed to have been Edmund's armor bearer. Well, Athelstan was the first king since Edmund to adopt the title Rex Anglorum, King of the English, in Athelstan's case, although in Edmund's case, it would perhaps be more accurately translated as King of the Angles. Athelstan also named one of his sons Edmund, who would go on to rule as King Edmund I. Slowly but surely, the story of St. Edmund was becoming not just an East Anglian tale, but the founding story of England itself, while Edmund was becoming England's patron saint. The figure of Edmund remained a key symbol of English resistance to the Danes. The saint's body was moved to London between 1010 and 1013 in order to protect it. And then, in 1016, the saint performed his greatest miracle yet. The Danish King Sweyn, who had sworn to tax the town of St. Edmund, cried out that he saw Edmund approaching him with a lance. This was while Sweyn was eating with his thanes at the town of Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. The saint, who was visible only to Sweyn himself, then pierced Sweyn with an invisible lance, and the king fell down dead. Now, in spite of the fact that Sweyn's son Canute then went on to defeat the English and assumed the throne of England, Canute seemed eager to appease St. Edmund. And on the 18th of October 2020, so we believe, the 4th anniversary of his victory over Ethelred at Assendoun, Canute founded a new Benedictine abbey at Bury St. Edmunds to replace the existing shrine keepers. Now, earlier this year, Bury St. Edmunds celebrated the belated millennium of the foundation of the abbey. That's because originally the celebrations were planned for 2020, but obviously couldn't go ahead. Now, this Benedictine abbey was made up of monks from Ely and St. Benet's Abbey in Norfolk, or possibly Ramsey, according to another theory. And it inherited those manors already given to the shrine in the 10th and 11th centuries. So between the late 9th century, when the shrine is established in Bury St. Edmunds, through to 1020, the shrine is this kind of ad hoc situation where in the Church of St. Mary, a group of priests and a group of lay people look after the shrine, but without following any kind of religious rule. So the introduction of the Benedictine rule in 1020 is certainly in line with the prevailing fashion that had been going on for more than a century for the introduction of the Benedictine rule as a way of regularizing and improving the standards of monastic life. In comparison to many other monasteries of the time, however, Bury St. Edmunds was on the back foot. Unlike Ely or Ramsey, Bury didn't have centuries of Benedictine observance, library building, and manuscript production behind it. And it also didn't have a single monumental church or a single royal patron before King Canute. But what it lacked in history and tradition, Bury made up for in local landholdings, some of which stretched back as far as the 940s. In the legal understanding of the time, lands given to the shrine and later to the monastery belonged to St. Edmund himself. They were held in his name, meaning that they were sacrosanct and inviolable. It meant that the penalty of sacrilege could be invoked on anyone who tried to alienate these lands of St. Edmund himself. During the course of the 10th and 11th centuries, the shrine built up a large yet piecemeal estate from donations. And those donations came mainly from minor aristocrats, minor Anglo-Saxon landholders who were giving individual manors. The historian Sarah Foote has argued that these aristocrats and their families and successors subsequently formed a household for St. Edmund, tying the saint at a deep level to the land and the people of East Anglia. And this is in contrast to some of the great religious houses, where a potentially alien and alienating monastic entity ruled over a huge domain donated by royal authority. But St. Edmund's shrine and his cult very much belonged to minor landowners, the Anglo-Saxon equivalent, if such a thing can be said to exist at this period, of a sort of middle class. And the evidence that we have for these donations and acts of patronage is mainly in the forms of wills and charters, although the survival of these documents is far from perfect. And I think we can certainly see in that continuation of the way that the shrine and the cult of St. Edmund are something that local people, albeit fairly wealthy landed local people, perpetuate, is the popular nature of that cult. From the very beginning, the cult of St. Edmund springs up spontaneously around the incorrupt body of the saint. It's not something that requires kings and great figures to intervene and decide that they're going to invent this cult. It's something which does genuinely emerge from that very fraught period of the Danish occupation and rule in East Anglia. Well, now that we've established some idea of the pattern of donations to the early Abbey of St. Edmund, we can begin to consider the possible involvement of Edith Swanneshals. Well, as I'm sure any of you who are interested in Edith are aware, historians remain divided on the precise identification of Edith or Ediths. Edith was known by multiple different names, in common with many high-status Anglo-Saxon women of the 11th century, which can make tracing the history of these women in later Anglo-Saxon England particularly challenging. Whether Edith the Fair, Edith Swanneck, Edgith, Edgifu, and Edgifu the Rich were always the same person is for other historians to judge. But a woman named Edgith or Edgifu was certainly in possession of large estates in East Anglia in the years before Hastings. And these estates were concentrated primarily in Cambridgeshire. That's to say the old county of Cambridgeshire, or Cambridgeshire proper, as distinct from the much expanded Cambridgeshire that we have today. The old Cambridgeshire did not include Huntingdonshire, it didn't include the Isle of Ely, and it was centred on the town of Cambridge itself and what we today would consider to be the district of South Cambridgeshire. At this stage, the lands of St. Edmund's Abbey were confined almost entirely to Suffolk, but Edith did own some lands there too. Some of these were in the east of the county, Harkstead near Ipswich and East Bergholt on the Suffolk-Essex border. The Abbey of St. Edmund didn't really have that much to do with the far east of the county at this stage. In fact, the area around Ipswich was, in fact, under the authority of the monastery of Ely. It was part of the ancestral lands of St. Etheldreda, Ethelthryth, who had given those lands to the monastery at Ely and was known as the Liberty of St. Etheldreda, the area around Ipswich and Woodbridge. So in a way, that's a bit of a red herring. But Edith also held at least two manors within the Liberty of St. Edmund itself, at Bayton, just east of Bury St. Edmunds, and at Norton, where she leased a manor from the abbot. Less certain is that Edith held the manor of Ixworth Thorpe, since this may instead have been held by Queen Edith of Wessex. So again, you've got there the problem that it can sometimes be difficult to identify which Edith we might be talking about here. The Liberty of St. Edmund, which I've mentioned, was itself a mid-11th century development. It was effectively a soak. That's to say, a unit smaller than a county, but that had county-like characteristics and freedoms and rights. And it originated in land holdings of King Edward's mother, Emma. The territory of the Liberty of St. Edmund roughly corresponded to the later county of West Suffolk, created in 1874, and it lasted for 100 years until it was replaced by the United County of Suffolk that we have today. And West Suffolk was a bit less than half of the total area of the county of Suffolk. East Suffolk is always a bit bigger because it's got that little tail that goes up towards the coast that we call Lothing Land. But West Suffolk has Bury St Edmunds right at its centre. It consisted of 8,500, and indeed sometimes it's actually known in the sources as simply the 8,500. And in 1043, King Edward granted his mother's soak to the abbot of St Edmunds. Now what this did was that it gave the abbot shrieval jurisdiction over the whole liberty, although confusingly the town of Bury St Edmunds itself was not part of the liberty and constituted a separate jurisdiction that was under even firmer control by the abbot. The liberty of St Edmund over time diminished in significance and in the control that the abbot exercised over it. For example, the honour of Clare after the Norman conquest, the area around Clare in the southern part of that liberty on the River Stour, that becomes very much a jurisdiction in its own right, although technically still part of the liberty of St Edmund. But the liberty of St Edmund did survive the Reformation, becoming known as the franchise of Bury. And indeed the Harvey family, the Harveys of Ickworth, the Marquises of Bristol, inherited the hereditary title as hereditary stewards of the liberty of St Edmund. As far as I know, the Marquis of Bristol is still nominally the hereditary steward of the liberty of St Edmund. 1043 was also the year in which Edward the Confessor granted the abbot the right to mint coins, as the abbot of St Edmunds began to take his place as one of the great magnates of the realm, exercising quasi-royal jurisdiction within his domains. Now, as the owner and the lessee of lands within the liberty of St Edmund, Edith would certainly have been considered, and may well have considered herself, to be part of the saint's spiritual household. While lay people like Edith could own lands and manors within the liberty, ecclesiastical patronage within the region was reserved to the abbot. It was up to the abbot, in other words, to supply clergy to parishes in the liberty, because the abbot was in effect the rector of every parish within the liberty of St Edmund. Therefore, it was up to the abbot to supply curates and clergy who would actually look after the spiritual needs of the people. And this helped direct lay devotion towards the abbey as the central nerve centre of church life. People tended to give their gifts not so much to the individual parish churches, but they would give their gifts to the abbey, knowing that it was in fact the abbey which was in control of all aspects of spiritual life in the region. And the liberty was also exempt from the jurisdiction of the bishops of Norwich, in whose diocese it was technically located. In the months leading up to King Edward's death, Bury St Edmunds received in 1065 a new abbot, a Frenchman named Baldwin, who was a monk of the Abbey of Saint-Denis outside Paris. Baldwin was the first foreigner appointed as the abbot of any English religious house, and his status was exceptional in the pre-conquest context. Baldwin had come to Edward's notice as his personal physician. He was a very learned doctor, the author of medical treatises, and much later he would establish Bury St Edmunds as a medical school. Edward rewarded Baldwin for his services, first with the church of Deerhurst in Gloucestershire, today renowned as a beautiful Anglo-Saxon church. You can still visit it and see essentially the same church that belonged to Baldwin because it hasn't changed. And then with St Edmunds. Baldwin seems to have been an exceptionally learned and resourceful figure, and his appointment on the eve of the conquest was a most fortuitous one for Bury. Baldwin became William the Conqueror's personal physician after Hastings, and the historian David Bates has speculated that the favour Baldwin received and his protected status may have derived from the fact that he alone, because he was present at the king's deathbed, knew the true circumstances of Edward the Confessor's death and who it was that Edward had named as successor on his deathbed. Of course, one of the great contests between Harold Godwinson and indeed the King of Norway and William the Bastard was this question of who it was that Edward wanted to succeed him as king. So perhaps Baldwin was the one man who knew. Because Baldwin enjoyed special protection and was, in any case, a Frenchman, he was not deposed as abbot after the conquest. And indeed, his abbacy ensured that West Suffolk was remarkably insulated from the effects of the conquest. The abbey was not compelled to give up any of its lands or privileges, and even transitioned uniquely among English abbeys to becoming a landholder in its own right in Normandy, thus reversing the usual subordinate position of English monasteries under Norman rule, where it was Norman landholders who would hold English monasteries. On the other hand, Baldwin did receive an order from William commanding him to seize for the crown the lands of anyone slain at the Battle of Hastings. So there were certainly Norman settlers, Norman landholders who came to live within the liberty of St. Edmund. Furthermore, the appointment of a Norman cleric to the See of East Anglia meant that Baldwin faced a bishop determined to assert his rights over Bury St. Edmunds, and indeed determined to seize the church that Baldwin had started building and turn it into his cathedral. And this is the monumental church that you will see if you go to Bury St. Edmunds today. You'll see its ruins. You'll see the enormous crypt that Baldwin constructed at this time. The dispute with the bishop rumbled on until 1093, when the bishops finally gave up and chose Norwich as the location of the see and started building an enormous cathedral that was supposed to rival the abbey at Bury St. Edmunds. However, the dispute with the bishops had unfortunate long-term consequences for the historiography of Bury St. Edmunds. Baldwin, as well as being a skilled physician, was also an adept forger. And his response to threats from the bishops, Herfast and Herbert de Luzinga, was to get creative with the Abbey's archive, manufacturing charters issued by Edmund I, Canute, Arthur Canute, and Edward the Confessor. And these charters were based to a greater or lesser extent on authentic documents. For example, Edmund I, we have an essentially fake charter dating to 946, supposedly, which grants this area known as the Ban Luca around Bury St. Edmunds, this area which is about a mile in extent, going east, north and west from Bury. And within that area, the abbot had total jurisdiction. And this is an interesting case because in this particular situation, it seems that the grant of the Ban Luca probably was genuine. We do think that it was genuinely ancient. But the charter itself, these specific words that we read from King Edmund that are attributed to him, very likely are not genuine. And we encounter a similar problem with the charter of Canute that founds the Abbey in the year 1020. We don't actually know for a fact that it was in the year 1020 that Canute founded the Abbey. We know that Canute did found it because we have contemporary evidence that wasn't tampered with by Baldwin that tells us this. For example, we have the Bury Psalter in the Vatican Library that tells us about events like the consecration of the Rotunda Church of St. Mary and St. Edmund in 1032, with Canute's earls being present. But the problem we've got is we've got this earlier charter which has been fabricated, and yet there are certain elements within this charter. For example, there's a clause about fish weirs, which, because of their archaic construction, historians have identified as being probably genuine. So again, we think there probably was a charter of King Canute, but that charter, after having been adapted, after having been forged, after having been improved, shall we say, by Baldwin, was destroyed because Baldwin didn't want the evidence that he was a forger to survive. So in effect, you have the creation of this compromised archive at Bury in Baldwin's abbacy, as a result of which we can't really rely on, we can't really trust a lot of the information we think we know about the early history of the Abbey. But be that as it may, The charters were based to a greater or lesser extent on authentic documents. But since the authentic documents themselves no longer survive, there's much debate about historians as to which parts of Baldwin's forged charters are real and which are fake. And the only thing to go on really in that case is the internal evidence. Unfortunately, this contamination of the archive eliminated much of the evidence for Anglo-Saxon patronage of the Abbey, including perhaps the evidence for Edith Swanneshals' involvement with the Abbey and with the cult of St. Edmund. We know virtually nothing, for example, about the Abbey during the brief reign of Harold Godwinson. We don't know what was really going on in the immediate years, months leading up to the Norman conquest. Many of Edith's lands were acquired after the conquest by Alan Rufus, Earl of Richmond, a Breton noble who accompanied William to England at the time of the conquest. Alan Rufus was the most important of the Norman magnates to be buried in the Abbey church at Bury St. Edmunds. For centuries, he was in fact the most high status burial that the Abbey possessed. But this was not Alan's only connection with Edith. He famously had a relationship with Edith and Harold's youngest daughter, Gunhild, who may or may not have been in religious vows, hence the controversy that attended their relationship. So famously, you've got a situation where a bishop writes to Gunhild, exhorting her not to have this relationship with Alan because she is essentially still in religious vows, a nun, perhaps a nun, or something midway between the lay state and the status of a nun. Perhaps she was in some sort of informal vows that she'd vowed perpetual chastity. But either way, so it certainly becomes a controversial issue, and historians remain divided on exactly what was going on here and what Gunhild's status really was. But whether Alan's relationship with Gunhild had anything to do with his acquisition of her mother's estates is impossible to establish. What we do know, however, is that ownership of Edith's former estates led Alan to consider himself part of the spiritual household of St. Edmund, and thus he sought burial in St. Edmund's church. So being in possession of these lands, mainly in what we today would consider to be South Cambridgeshire, but also a few lands in Suffolk, is enough to build a relationship, a devotional relationship between Alan Rufus and the shrine of St. Edmund, which means that he then feels devoted enough to be buried at the shrine of St. Edmund. And that raises interesting questions about Edith's relationship to St. Edmund, about whether Alan perhaps came under the influence of Edith's daughter Gunhild. Was it Gunhild who influenced Alan to become devoted to St. Edmund? As a Breton nobleman, he would have had no previous connection with this local saint. And it's certainly notable that when we look at the way in which English saints were treated after the Norman conquest, some English saints were downgraded. Some of them had their cults essentially were, if not quashed, they were certainly regarded as being something less than desirable. Saints who were favored by the Normans were brought in. This doesn't seem to have happened for Edmund. If anything, the cult of St. Edmund becomes bigger after the Norman conquest. And this is one of the really interesting features actually of devotional life in the Norman period, is what happens with this cult of St. Edmund. Well, to conclude, the direct evidence for a connection between Edith Swanneshals and St. Edmund's Abbey is quite meagre. But as a major landholder in East Anglia, she would undoubtedly have considered herself to be part of the spiritual household of Edmund, along with other East Anglian aristocrats. In the decades after the Norman conquest, the strength of local and national identification with St. Edmund among the English would only intensify. Now, there's a number of possible reasons for this. Could it be that acts of devotion were a kind of safe outlet for resistance to Norman rule? Was the only way that people could identify themselves as English, that they could assume that national identity by showing their devotion towards this most English, most distinctively English of saints? Well, perhaps that's one interpretation. Or was it because St. Edmund's Abbey was left largely unscathed by the Norman cataclysm? It was almost by default that Edmund turns into the most important of English saints, because he's the saint whose cult remains supported by patronage, that remains endowed with estates and manors and so forth. Or is it that the Normans themselves adopted the cult of St. Edmund quite self-consciously in order to perform their own Englishness? In other words, they didn't feel that they were English enough. They wanted to be seen as English. And one of the ways that you identify your national identity at this period, long before the formation of what we would consider to be states with identities based on a common language or a common flag or national anthem or anything like that, one of the ways in which you form a sort of proto-national identity is around the figure of a saint. We see the same thing with the significance of St. Patrick for the Irish, the significance of St. David for the Welsh. And so it may be that the Normans proclaimed their Englishness by this identification with St. Edmund. Well, whatever the reason, by 1097, which was the year that Baldwin died, having really strengthened his monastery and turned it into a major devotional center, a French abbot, Lambert of Angers, who was visiting England, was able to declare with confidence that the English claimed St. Edmund as their patron saint, a status that Edmund would retain until the 14th century, in spite of challenges from Edward the Confessor and Thomas Becket. And certainly it's one of those strange survivals from Anglo-Saxon England that managed to leap over the cataclysm of the conquest, that the cult of St. Edmund, to which Edith, Swanneshals, to which Harold were no doubt devoted, that managed to continue well into medieval England, in some ways right up to the period of the Reformation. But I'm going to finish there, and I believe that I'll be available for a live question and answer session shortly, and I'll look forward to hearing any questions that you may have about Edith's relationship to the Abbey, about Edmund, about Berry, but please ask any question you like, and I shall do my very best to answer them. Thank you very much.